This is Cantus Firmus, Kingdom Theology for Christians without a country.
V54 with the ego, yup. Big bad me moving to the left. I'm seeing bang roll, but I never stop until he says.
Greetings, you're listening to Cantus Firmus. I'm Cody Cook. So I'm pro-life, and I've been struggling for a while now with this question about how to have better conversations about abortion. And the recent news about Roe v. Wade being knocked down has only made this struggle more pressing. I've always known that I need to be careful with how I talk about abortion and the women who have them. So I've been intentional about not using emotionally charged or insulting language like some anti-abortion people do. For instance, words like murder that imply an evil intention that I don't think most women who've had abortions bear. But not too long ago, I had some conversations about abortion where I tried to talk very objectively and unemotionally about what abortion is, and I tried to avoid that emotional language, and those conversations still went very south. It wasn't until later that I realized that the reason they went south was probably because the people I was talking to had either had an abortion or helped someone else to get an abortion. So because of that kind of investment emotionally, they weren't really trying to get to the bottom of what abortion is. That wasn't their goal in the conversation. They were repeating talking points, I think, in a lot of cases, which they had accepted to protect their psyches from coming to terms with what they might have done if it turns out they were wrong. And so there was a lot of skin in that game, so to speak. Being shown that you're wrong on something like that could be really emotionally, devastating. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's kind of what happened in some of these conversations. Hearing some of these arguments undermine their rationales, and that made them very upset and defensive. And so what I learned from this was that even addressing this topic without the emotional language can cause a lot of pain and conflict for people. And I'm not interested in shaming people who've had abortions. There's not a benefit to doing it. In fact, I want people who've had abortions to know that there's grace for them, just as there is for every one of us. But I do want to change minds about abortion and maybe prevent future abortions. So that makes me think I should be talking about what abortion is and why the arguments for it don't stand up to scrutiny. So that makes me feel kind of stuck. How do I have these productive conversations about abortion that can change minds, but that don't cause unnecessary shame or conflict? And that's why I wanted to talk to Jessica Green. She's the co-host of the Mad Ones podcast, and they've been generous enough to have me on a couple times. And she has a story that makes her someone who understands both sides of this issue. And I'll link to a couple Mad Ones podcasts where that story came out a little bit. But I wanted to thank her for being here to kind of help me try to maybe publicly work through my own complicated feelings on this. So Jessica, thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So can you tell me a little bit about yourself and why this issue is meaningful for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I probably spent most of my adult life as a very left progressive, pro-choice person who, like a lot of people, as you mentioned, who support abortion or abortion rights, has myself had an abortion. And so there is, as you very correctly said, a lot of psychological baggage that goes along with dealing with the fact that you might have killed a person. And while I agree with you that inflammatory language, such as calling people murderers, is not going around, having productive conversations, it's also important to realize that both sides of this argument are talking so far past each other that it's almost as though like no one is actually having that argument. They're saying their points at each other, but no one's actually listening to the other side. And more than anything, we're having a vocabulary argument before we're having an ethical argument, because we're not agreeing to terms about whether or not the ending of a human life at any stage of its development constitutes the killing of a person. Is a fetus a person? And at what level do they become? Many people who are pro-life believe that moment happens at conception. And then there are those who say they believe that it doesn't happen right up until you're arrived from the birth canal. Although somehow magically 5 minutes before that, you're not a human being yet.
Or at some point along the way. Like
right.
Viability, even though it's an external standard, right? It's like, well, it used to be, science couldn't save you unless you were, over 24 weeks. but now we've developed these new technologies. And
Right.
so your personhood is now dependent upon the advancement of science outside of your body.
And if we're having honest ethical arguments about that, what about people who are disabled and can't live on their own without machines or without the aid of a nurse or some other caregiver? There are lots of people who aren't viable in the wild, you know? That's most of us, to be honest. If you dropped us off in the woods somewhere with a knife and a compass, we're not going to do too well. We're
Sure.
very, very dependent, all of us on some level on each other. So again, we're coming up with this argument. It's not a new argument either. It's existed for a long time, that there are certain people who don't qualify as people. And to me, that's the crux of the argument. We're deciding whether these people are people or not. And we as a society, as a human society, have had that argument about other kinds of people. Had it about, you know, the African slaves that were brought over, whether they were whole people or not. Or are we just taking our place of dominance within the animal kingdom? And, you know, all those cards start unfolding where we realize that a lot of these arguments are making excuses for ourselves about why we can call certain people non-humans. And unfortunately, the unborn, who are the people least equipped to defend themselves, are now the people being termed non-people. And so if you're dealing with a person who's of a very progressive mindset, who is very much steeped in this ideology of inequality being a great evil within our society, something that I found very convincing is the way that we dehumanize, that the dehumanization of unborn people mimics these other points in our human history where we're using the dehumanizing aspect to control the lives of others. And so that's not necessarily a religious argument. So there are arguments that we can have, ethical arguments that we can have, that don't stem from, well, it's murder because my God said so, or it's not murder because my biology teacher said it's a clump of cells. Those two arguments they'll sail right past each other and not make a dent. You have to argue with people, not argue, maybe you have to discuss things people are at home with and comfortable with. In terms like murder or inflammatory, you're not going to get anywhere with that.
Well, and one thing I've been kind of wondering a little bit, you know, it seems that in a lot of cases, things, you know, ideologies shift over time. It's almost like, you know, people sort of slowly but surely move into this new direction because of this sort of pressure, or because the culture starts to shift. And, you know, what do you call it? The Overton window or whatever they call it.
Yeah, the idea of what's acceptable within society. Right.
And for me, I think that's almost intolerable, because I would like to have a conversation and figure it out, and then and then, you know, once we've established what the reality is, we just need to go along with that. And it feels very strange to have some of these conversations, because, like you said, we're having two different conversations, but there's also this, you know, in my experience, there's a handful of pro-choice people who I think will acknowledge certain basically incontestable facts, and then they'll say, yes, but we should still allow it because of this rationale or this other rationale.
Sure.
You know, yes, I agree that it's a baby, but there's still autonomy to be considered. And you know, so at least there's some honesty there that I can respect. But I find that so many of these conversations that I have with pro-choice people, they're making arguments that they would, in any other circumstance, view as pseudoscientific and special pleading. And that makes it, I think, hard to have a conversation. You know, because ultimately, and which is not to say that I haven't heard pro-life people make fallacious arguments, but you know, ultimately, all these political conversations can get emotional. They're filled with these logical fallacies. But this issue feels more intense. And I think it's probably because for a lot of people, you know, I think the Guttmacher Institute, which is Planned Parenthood's research wing, has come up with this number of a quarter of women have had abortions.
Yeah, that's what I read earlier today when I was curious about this, about how many of us are walking around, and it's a significant portion of the population.
Yeah.
So it's really kind of wild when people are from the pro-life side are coming out saying, well, we should jail all of these women. They should be punished, all of these women. I mean, you're talking about like significant portions of the population, women who have children now, who are mothers now taking care of kids. Like you're talking about something that we have to integrate into our society as something that happened. We had 50 years where it was legal to kill children in the womb. That's an enormous wound that we've dealt ourselves as a society. And to treat it with anything other than tender care is cutting off our nose to spite our face.
Yeah.
We're damaging an entire generation of women far more than they've already been damaged if we don't handle them with grace and forgiveness.
Sure. Well, there's the grace forgiveness from, you know, that's one of those areas where I think my faith does come into it, because largely my arguments are biological and scientific, and you know, just trying to be sort of logical about it. But yes, the grace component is definitely a place where I think my Christian faith comes in, how I want to look at this. But yeah, you're right. I mean, to sort of have this, you know, kind of strong arm approach after, you know, we've had some kind of like, I don't know, made some legal inroads to sort of dealing with abortion, I guess.
Yeah.
Makes me think about, because I've been spending a lot of time looking at the arguments made for and against slavery in the 1800s, and how they tried to sort of come up with these solutions about, well, some states can have it and some states can. A lot of these really, there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
Especially with the personhood thing, with what we're talking about with abortion today. And, you know, thankfully, you know, abolitionists and Northerners didn't say, okay, anybody who's ever owned a slave, we need to kill now.
Right.
You know what I mean? That would have been absolutely not the right way to go about it.
You can acknowledge that the practice is evil without saying that anyone who's participated in the practice for the last generation is, you know, have to be stricken from the society. This is a problem we have with progressive leftism in its current form, is that it offers no grace and forgiveness if you do something that's, you know, antithetical to what the culture says you ought to do. And this is sort of backwards from the things that Christians believe, because we're actually like aware of the human condition and the tendency towards sin. So if something happens, even something as horrible as realizing, oh my God, I have murdered my own child, that's a incredible, for somebody like me, I won't kill a bug if I don't have to. If I can get that spider outside, I'm going to try and do that. To realize that you murdered your own child, and that the clump of cells argument doesn't really hold water as much as you thought it did when you were a teenager, that's an incredible blow to your psyche. And we're talking about a quarter of the female population in this country. Do you know how many people are walking around with that millstone around their neck? I mean, there is nothing more pastoral that we can do for these women than offer them a way back, offer them the hope that they can still, you know, be good people, that they can still live good lives, that God still loves them. And we have to develop that grace back into our society, develop that forgiveness back into our society. We've lost it. And with it, we've lost the way that we value human life, which has allowed all of this to continue. I think not to get too far off topic, but I think this is all the product and the fruits of the sexual revolution of the 1960s. We are all of this death and destruction and the horrible wound that we've dealt to an entire generation of women comes from the sexual revolution. And we as a society still have a way back from that, but we have to choose it. It's not something that can be forced onto us by the state, no more than we want them to force people to live in this means that allows the murder of children. We have to make it a change of the heart within our society more than a system of laws, because the outlawing of abortion won't stop abortions. That's an argument that we hear and we dismiss it, but it's true. It will happen. People are still going to do it. So we have to create a society that supports women who get pregnant under non-ideal circumstances.
Yeah.
And that's a conversation that I don't think a lot of people on the conservative side of things are willing to have. It's that you remain a perfect virgin until you get married, or you're a cast off from our society. And we treat women who get pregnant as though they're doing something that's ruined their lives. If you get pregnant before you get married, you've ruined your life. Now, what do we expect young women to do? We don't give them any support. So that's where I think like there's a mentality change that has to happen even amongst pro-life people who are very often Christian, that teen pregnancy isn't the end of your life. It's not it's not that shameful of a thing. We don't have to hide in a closet about it. We have to acknowledge that it happens and then help these children to come into the world happy and healthy.
Yeah, I'd had a biblical scholar named Randolph Richards on a few weeks ago. He'd co-written a book called Misreading Scripture with Individual Asides, and he'd made a point that I thought was pretty fascinating about how in the East they sort of have this understanding that if you, like, for example, let teenagers, two teenagers of opposite sex who are attracted to each other get together, they're probably going to have sex. And so there was, because of that, the community and the parents had felt that they sort of had a responsibility. If a teenager got pregnant, they sort of said, well, this was our fault. This was our failing. And as a result of that, we are going to try to make this right by helping this couple and this child in our community, right? And particularly in churches, I think he was talking about specifically, but that was the way that these sort of churches in the East that he was a part of and assisted and visited, that's how they looked at it, which is not how we look at it. We've imbibed a lot of this individualism stuff where you're kind of responsible for yourself and, good luck.
Yeah.
But that doesn't leave a lot of room for mistakes, and I think, having sex as a teenager before you're married is a mistake, and it's not something you ought to do, but it's also one of those things that in many cases we can hide our mistakes. But when you're pregnant, there's a certain shame that this is a mistake now that you're going to be showing off. And I think abortion begins to look really attractive.
Yeah.
And as a way to kind of get things back to normal, to not have to admit you maybe did something you shouldn't have. But as a church, we have to acknowledge that you can make mistakes and you can still be embraced by the community and you can still be loved. And there is something.
There's something so anti-feminine about the way we've devalued motherhood, devalued the bearing of children, to the point where if a girl becomes pregnant, that it's considered the greatest shame that can befall her, and that her life is over now because the shame and the stain of motherhood is upon her, instead of what a blessing, we've been given another life, that God has given us this child, and that we as a community are happy to receive another Christian soul into our midst.
Yeah.
Like where's that it's a great study in the grace and forgiveness that we're supposed to show each other in the community, because these are the most vulnerable, our teenagers, our young kids that are just coming into their adulthood when they're most prone to make mistakes. Yeah. How are we going to, what do we want grace to be shown to us? Then it is imperative on us that we show them grace and bring them into a community that is happy to have them. Yeah. And I think that is the way you prevent abortions, more than any kind of law that could exist on the books in any of these states. I think Alabama is a near total ban on abortions, including rape and incest. Only the life of the mother is an exception. That is all well and good, and I suppose that's a reason for pro-lifers to celebrate. But what would really prevent abortions from happening is treating pregnancy like an honor.
Yeah.
Giving the due to motherhood that it deserves. Because women, that used to be considered a great calling, like a deep spiritual calling to be a mother. And now it's considered something that gets in the way of your real life.
Well, sorry, go on.
What a shame to be brought up in that environment where your mother considers you a hindrance to her life,
Well, I like what you said about the shame of motherhood, because you're right. It's not the shame of fornication or premarital sex, because as long as you can get away with that, it's not that big of a deal. It's getting pregnant or getting someone pregnant that's
On the money.
that's what causes the shame, right? Yeah, so that seems to be very counterproductive to an ethic of life. And what's interesting too, I mean, and that's something that the fundamentalist approach shares with the sexual revolution, as we talked about it. Right, that it's this kind of disconnection and shaming of the sort of our kind of our natural functions and what we can and in many cases ought to be, right? I was thinking about when you brought up the sexual revolution, there's a pro-abortion philosopher named Eileen McDonough who wrote a book called Breaking the Abortion Deadlock from Choice to Consent. And she's one of those who basically sort of acknowledge, yes, what we're talking about is a life, but nevertheless, if the mother doesn't consent at any point, I mean, she may have been ready to have a baby and wanted to do it, but if at 8 months or 9 months she decides she's not interested anymore, she doesn't consent, abortion is an ethical option for her, right?
Right.
And there's a line in her book that I still remember to this day when she refers to the puritanical notion that sex leads to pregnancy. That she says that she thought that we had dispelled that in the sexual revolution, and so
that would be a neat trick to dispel nature itself.
Yeah. Well, but it's essentially it's essentially this idea, though. I mean, what she's getting at is we've created this sort of artificial kind of relationship with each other by producing, these birth control and stuff like that, so we can put ourselves at a distance from the natural consequences. And so when when someone does get pregnant and they didn't intend to, it's like a surprise,
So, and that's the thing, we come at it from this argument of pretending we can control the natural tendencies of teenagers, and that the consequences of those actions are necessarily harmful to their lives. We're arguing about something, I think, that is beyond the point. If the point is that it's a hindrance to it's a hindrance to your education, for example, to have a child out of wedlock, what are we doing to remove the hindrances to education that motherhood entail? Are there ways we can make it easier for mothers to get educations? This seems like the avenue of attack, not to remove the children, not to abort the babies. If getting mothers into college is really the goal, what are we doing on the college level to make it easier for mothers to be there? And so that's why I find the pro-choice argument a little disingenuous, because the things that they're bringing up aren't actually being held from a perspective of how do we solve those problems. They're being held from the perspective that the child itself is the problem. Yeah. And then again, we're arguing about the term. Is this a child? Is this a unique human life? If you believe it is a unique human life, then there's no option to wipe it off the planet because it's inconvenient. So, every time I have this argument with somebody, I bring it back to terms. Are we saying that this is not a unique human life? Because if you can't even agree to that point, then we're not having a conversation at all. You're just not.
Well, keeping in mind that a quarter of the women someone might speak to have had an abortion, right? And I'm going to presume that most of those women identify as pro-choice, although some of them change their minds or maybe say, well, I'm pro-life, but I had this one thing that happened to me and it doesn't count. Right? Wow. But it counts for other people, which happens sometimes. But I'm going to presume that most of those women are pro-choice. That suggests to me that, at the upper limits, half of pro-choice women that you speak to have had an abortion. At the upper limits, probably less than that, but maybe we'll say a quarter. So if someone is, whether you're a male or a female, if you're talking with a woman who's pro-choice, there's a decent chance that she's had an abortion, so it's going to feel very personal to her. And I guess what I'm wondering is there a way to have that conversation, or is that something, or is it, can we not even have that conversation? Is it like St. Francis, supposedly said, preach the gospel, use words when necessary. Are we just supposed to sort of turn our churches into these places for women and children and show that we're going to help and just let that do the work for us? Or do we have to persuade? And it seems to me that persuasion should be part of it, but I'm just not really sure how to approach it when you're talking to people who are, I think, trying to protect their psyches, right? And so maybe my question would be, you can answer that broadly, but I might ask, what changed your mind? Was it something that happened over time, or was it a conversation, or what was it that they did that?
So I think when you're talking to people and they have a negative reaction to what you're saying to them, you assume that they leave that interaction never again thinking about what you've said to them. They are like rejecting it, and you think, well, I didn't get through to them. What you don't realize is that, 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, they may still have those words ringing in their head. And you don't know that those conversations you had where they rejected you, they're not at some point later on letting that thought develop into something else. And I think that is what happened with me, because I can't pinpoint any one single conversation that made me decide, okay, yes, this is the moment where I am now pro-life. I think it happened over a slow period of time where the arguments began to build on themselves. And I too was very uncomfortable with the thought that I had killed someone. That's an incredible pill to swallow. Yeah. And when you do come close to swallowing that pill, if you're able to get past that point where you reject the thought utterly and you try to accept it, there are other things that come with it, including suicidal thinking, depression, trauma. I mean, you're going to have a whole host of mental issues that a lot of people are going to need help to deal with. And so there is post-abortion counseling out there, just for anybody who might know somebody who's experiencing that kind of transition where they're starting to accept it and it's causing them severe depression. There is help out there from women who have been through that darkness and come out the other side and have come to realize that God loves them, that they're alive today on earth because God wants them here, and that there is a way to, make that into an experience that helps other women not go through the same darkness that you went through. And when you do act as a lighthouse to other people who are lost, it does in some way make what happened to you start to make sense. So that's just kind of my take on that. Yeah. But if you're experiencing cognitive dissonance, which is you're hearing an idea that confronts and conflicts directly with what you've come to believe, it can cause you physical pain in your mind. Like you have physical, actual pain that happens in your head because you're experiencing an idea that is so hateful to you. And in that moment, you might reject it. But there are sometimes the person telling you these things doesn't realize that they're planting seeds. And so you can say your piece, but I wouldn't fight with someone to the point where they're upset. Because if they're upset, they're finding the idea very hateful. They're going to fight against it with everything that they have as a mechanism of self-defense. And that's not the greatest way to reach people. I think the other thing you said is the more operative thing. If you're out there doing the work where you're supporting pregnant women, you're supporting, but if you're a guy, you can support pregnancy centers. Are you telling your children? Are you telling your daughters that if they get pregnant, you're going to love them, you're going to love their child, you're going to support them, we're a family and we're in this together? Because it's our daughters that are going to experience the next wave of unintended pregnancies. And glory to God for all things, including unintended pregnancies. We have to create a culture that supports them and not vilifies them. That is the way to make the argument. Because when others see Christians supporting their unintended pregnancies with joy and love and gratitude, then it's like abortion becomes an unthinkable option. I could not think to have an abortion when I know how happy my parents will be that I'm pregnant. There's a shift that can happen in our consciousness that pregnancies don't ruin lives. Yeah. They're blessings. Glory to God.
Well, and you had, we're talking about kind of how we present ourselves, kind of the light. I did think about Norma McCorvey, who was the Roe and Jane Roe, who I think had maybe some, anyway, maybe some personal problems, psychological problems. I know she went back and forth on this issue at different points in her life, but I remembered an interview with her where, so after she sort of came out as Jane Roe, as you know, and publicly, she was hired on an abortion clinic and had this experience where she went and looked in the freezer and saw what they had, what they were storing. But that was
That's a rough day.
That was an important moment for her. But perhaps more important was that there was a pastor or somebody who was part of one of those, kind of life pregnancy centers, who tried to spark a friendship with her. It was very kind and knew who she was and still showed her a lot of love. And that gave her sort of somebody to talk to when she started working through those feelings. And so, regardless of wherever she ended up, I thought that was an important story, because she became, at that point, for at least some time in her life, kind of a pro-life advocate. But I do think that's important. And, to try to kind of piece together a couple of things, I'm trying to come up with sort of guidance for myself on this.
Sure.
If I'm talking to somebody who's pro-choice, particularly a woman, but it could be a man who's maybe someone he cares about, who's had an abortion or he's encouraged to get an abortion.
Sure.
It could be very emotional for him as well, very personal. Maybe the couple of things I want to keep in mind are that if the conversation seems like it's going in the wrong direction, it's important to probably pull out of that conversation graciously and gracefully.
Absolutely.
Because you're not trying to create pain. And so be very attuned to that. But maybe the other thing is, maybe a couple other things, like I talked about, not using the super emotional or accusatory language, I think is important. But in addition to that, I think seasoning those conversations with grace, I think is kind of the other side of that. Not only not using nasty language, but being very positive about grace being a real thing, and that
And another thing I might add to that is, don't make the person you're talking to responsible for other pro-life or pro-choice arguments that you've heard. Because there's a lot of really wild people on both sides who are making batshit crazy arguments on both sides. And so I expect to be taken as an individual at my own words. And so if you're comparing me to another pro-life argument that you heard that I might not even hold, I think that would be dishonest and unfair. So I think that pro-lifers owe that to pro-choicers too, that just because you've seen, there are people, you'll see the protesters where they're ripping up the baby dolls and be like, yeah, we love killing baby. Not every person with a pro-choice slant is like that. We're all individuals. So just, take people, if you know this person to be a good and kind person, give them the benefit of that, and don't conclude that they're approaching this from malice. That there might, maybe they're misguided. If they understood where you were coming from, they might feel differently because you know them to be a good person. So give them the benefit of the doubt too.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And yeah, I like that. That's good, because I think a lot of the times, you hear about this with a lot of issues, right? You could be a parent with a gay teenager and not realize it. And you're talking about, the way those homosexuals act and behave and what you're saying something that's this very broad, nasty statement about people that you actually care about and that aren't that way. Right. And so if you go into a conversation talking about those baby killers, and somebody that you care about, who you know to be a kind and well-intentioned person who's had an abortion, that's devastating. And they know that you're not a safe person at that point as well, or at least and they, at least they're not willing to give you a shot. And
you may think that no one around you is like that. Oh, no one I know has had an abortion. Well, you don't know that. It's a lot more people than you think, and a lot of people don't tell anyone. There are friends that I had for 10 years or more who didn't know that I had had an abortion until I started speaking openly about it. And I didn't start speaking openly about it until I became pro-life. So when I was pro-choice, I was quiet and shameful about what had occurred. And only when I became pro-life did I find a supportive enough environment to actually speak about it honestly, and like received love and care as a result of that. And so, you know, I attribute that to the Christian community that I'm part of. But we have to show ourselves as Christians through our acts, which means that we, you know, are graceful and we are forgiving when we encounter people who have done things that we consider morally incorrect.
Yeah.
And that's sort of, you know, I think often about Mary, the mother of God, and how she was a pregnant teenager, and basically the last place in time that you ever wanted to be a pregnant teenager. And, you know, there was not a lot of grace and forgiveness for a pregnant teenager in that position. And yet her unplanned pregnancy changed the fabric of humanity. And so we have to look at these as wonderful blessings and not shameful acts to be hidden, to be celebrated, even to be joyed over.
Yep. I was going to say there's maybe some political cleanup maybe to do now that Roe v. Wade's happened.
Yes.
And or even just kind of just thinking it through and talking about it, because I had mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand I thought, you know, hey, this could be good, that maybe that's less babies dying. That could be a positive thing, right?
For a time, yeah.
And you know, I'm kind of libertarian, swaying back and forth with anarchism sometimes. So I have some mixed feelings about government intervention. But it seems to me that if you're going to have a government, one of the things they probably ought to prevent is aggression and killing people and that sort of thing. So it seems reasonable that they would have something to say about abortion. Although, as we discussed, not in a heavy-handed or, you know, kind of way. But the kind of with that in mind, though, I know that I don't know that you use a lot of political labels now, but in the past you sort of identified as libertarian. And I think that means you're more aware than many of us are about how government messes pretty much everything up that it does.
Yeah.
And so my question would be, are you concerned about some conservative states going overboard and creating undue restrictions or invasions of privacy for women?
Yeah. So I've heard claims to that effect. And I certainly know that that's possible. A lot of times the state, anytime it tries to correct anything, it overcorrects. And I am unhappy about the idea of the government legislating any of this, because while we in the US have experienced abortion up to 9 months free and clear by choice, there are other places in the world, like China, for example, where abortions were forced on people during their one-child policy. So anytime the government has its hands involved in something so personal as the medical decisions of women about whether they'll reproduce or not, the effects can be very bad. So I don't want that at all. However, I agree with you that if there's to be a government at all, and I don't know a time when there wasn't, at the very least, they should protect the lives of the most innocent human beings. And so we are at an impasse amongst a bunch of people about whether we agree that a fetus, an unborn fetus, is a human being or not. And that's what they're using, a lot of different legal arguments. Oh, it's about medical privacy. It's about this. It's about that, to find a way to argue around the idea that fetuses don't have human rights. And so, you know, I think I don't think that this condition where Roe v. Wade is repealed right now will be the permanent state of things. Another case will come through the courts where federal abortion is enacted again. This isn't the end of the road. The progressive left is not going to sit on their hands and go, oh, I guess we lost this one on a technicality. They'll be going back and forth about this for quite a long time. In the meantime, the most effective means we can have as individuals isn't involved in the state. Whether states have overreaching laws preventing abortions, or they have free and clear abortions up to 9 months. The most effective way to prevent abortions is on the ground level, what we're doing as a society and a culture. So, you know, that's where I want to put my focus, not necessarily worrying about what one state or another is going to do, because we have to operate around that regardless. They'll pass laws, they'll repeal laws. None of that is my concern. My concern is how we treat the unborn and the women who are carrying those pregnancies.
Well, and I hope that those who've been pro-life activists will try to follow that through consistently in pushing back against laws that that go overboard, that do violate the privacy and rights of women. Like, pro-choicers, point out, well, basically there's two people involved in an abortion, and pro-choicers, lean on, well, whatever the mother wants, that's what's important. And I, one thing I think is they're right about is that pregnancy is complicated because it involves a woman's body, and it's the only time where, other than like maybe conjoined twins, where two people are tied together in that sort of way. And I think that makes abortion complicated, but I still don't think it justifies deadly force. But it does mean that I think from a legal perspective, we can't treat abortion like we treat murder or homicide, where we would, a woman's body would become a crime scene after a miscarriage, right?
Sure. Right.
So I think, pro-lifers need to be very clear about where the focus needs to be on as far as how we're trying to stop abortions.
I don't think that they considered, sorry to interrupt, I'm so sorry. They didn't consider miscarriages to be murders before abortion was legal. I think that that's kind of a put on.
It could be, but I could see some kind of, hot-shotting right-wing prosecutor going after a woman who's maybe had a miscarriage because, some of the details looked a little funny. I think you're probably right. There's some of these examples you hear where it's like they're going to have police at state lines making sure nobody's sneaking out to get an abortion.
See, that's kind of crazy to me, because they couldn't even get people to take COVID tests. Yeah. I don't understand how they're going to stop every car at the border and get you out to take a piss test to see if you're pregnant or not. It's just like the practicality of it just seems like, so.
But I can't see I could imagine situations where there were a state or a prosecutor or whatever would go overboard. And I think we need to be, as pro-lifers, especially if we've been activists on this, I think we need to be saying, okay, we want to protect babies, but we also care about mothers, and this is too much. We can't do this. This is inappropriate. If there's a law that goes further than it needs to.
But see, that's the thing, is like I hear about that, but I haven't seen that come into action. Like when I see that come into action, I think that would be a point where, you would have legal intervention. But so far, even in the strictest of states like Alabama, which had a trigger law that went into effect like that, and it banned pretty much every abortion except for the life of the mother. But then on the news, you hear them saying, well, it's banning virtually all abortions. So they don't want you to understand that there are exceptions for medical emergencies. They want you to believe that it's like, what's that Margaret Atwood book, the Handmaid's Tale. They want you to think that they're doing the Handmaid's Tale, and they're not. So like I encourage people, when you hear something in the news media, I mean, you have to look into it for yourself, because they're largely using language to make you believe a thing that's not necessarily true. And I agree with that. A lot of that is a put on, I think.
I think so too. Yeah, the way we politicize these sort of horror stories. Or make them up, or make them be the universal. But I do think, if there was a state that said we're going to ban abortions even when it would save the mother's life, I hope that pro-lifers would say that's actually not appropriate, because the mother's a human being with the right to self-defense, and that's a choice she should be able to make, actually.
You hear these if this then arguments all the time, where it's like, oh, if you're so pro-life, then why don't we end the death penalty? And I'm like, yo, sign me up. I mean, you're painting a dishonest picture of people who are pro-life if you say that they are all also in support of the death penalty, because you've constructed a straw man pro-lifer in your mind that you've decided this is what we all believe. But pro-lifers, we do that too with the pro-choicers. So we're talking right past each other because you're seeing a hysterical blue-haired college, co-ed who's had 15 abortions. And that's just not the length and breadth of it. It's somebody, whose sister had a ectopic pregnancy, or, their girlfriend got pregnant when they were teenagers and they were scared, and they because of the shame our society puts on pregnancy, they did what they thought that they had to do. And we have to really realize that these constructions, these straw man constructions, aren't real. We made them up.
Yeah.
And stop arguing about them because they're not real.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, that's fair. Well, and I think another thing I'd maybe say in the opposite direction is, we've talked about the frightened teenager and so on and so forth. I think that there are a lot of women who've said, well, I have 3 kids already, I'm pregnant again, I'm not ready to have another one. And they may be in a secure situation, they're not scared. They just don't really value that thing until it's born. And I think it's also a part of, that's why I think we do still need to have conversations about what it is that we're talking about.
Sure.
Because that's actually a decent percentage of abortions that take place. But yes, anyway. So I know that you're, as a Christian and Christian who sort of has these sort of libertarian leanings, especially, you're inclined to reject the violence of the state. Is it a mistake, do you think, that we've approached abortion as a political issue and not as like a spiritual issue that requires non-coercive means like prayer, persuasion, evangelism? Is it a both and, or is it an either or? How do you feel about that? Because that complicated my feelings a little bit once I started to sort of move into more anarchist kind of perspectives.
Yeah, I understand the idea that you're moving it down from the federal government to the state government. So you're decentralizing the control of this aspect, but you're not resting that control with the individual people. And so there is that libertarian argument about that. But we also don't allow individual people to murder one another. I have a hard time understanding the ethical argument behind that. Yes, the mother didn't get to choose to kill her child. But if a mother kills her child after it's born, she is considered a murderer. That's a unique human life, a defenseless human life that was, taken before its time. That's not a religious or spiritual argument at all. We agree that murder is wrong, whether we're spiritual or not. So there's, I would have to have the ethical argument made to me that it's not, the destruction of a unique human life. And they failed to do that. So I haven't read the entire 267-page Supreme Court opinion as to why Roe was turned over specifically. But what I do on a very sort of global level understand is that you're moving control of this issue from the federal government down to the state government.
Yeah.
So that on some level has to please the libertarian yin that says, we want to decentralize power. That's been accomplished here. Is it perfect? No, but everything in life is a trade-off. That's certainly something that a libertarian should understand.
Yeah, the trade-off thing is a fair point. Yeah, I think for me, if I think about like slavery, for example, I would rather have a federal 14th Amendment saying that you can't enslave people than saying, well, let's let the states decide. Because I think in that case, what the federal government is standing up for the individual and the state government might not. And so even though you're decentralizing, you're getting closer to the individual. In some cases, what you could actually be doing is making it harder on the individual and violating that individual's rights. As a Christian, I think, as I'm called to reject violence, it makes me feel very complicated about political solutions. As a libertarian, I think political solutions are often bad. But as a Christian, I would say, I don't really want to vote or support violence in any case. But I do understand that God has, kind of ordained that there be some systems in place to punish those who kill and steal And even if I, as a Christian, maybe want to sort of be apart from that to some extent, I can recognize that there's if you're going to have a state, they ought to make it so it's harder to kill people, or you can get away with it at least, right?
If the state's going to exist at all, but it refuses to protect the absolute most innocent form of life that we have, then you are having trouble with me making an ethical argument at all for any kind of government. And at that point, what's the ethical argument for us not killing each other? I want your gold watch, and I have the ability to smack you over the head and take it. What's the ethical argument at that point for me not doing it? I mean, all things go out the window once we've decided that the smallest, most innocent, least able to defend itself human life is not human. And, this is a societal, that's where you're reaching the spiritual problem. The problem is the devaluation of the human life. It's never going to be fixed in the government until we fix it in our local environment, in our churches and in our homes. And we're telling our children, you know what, I would, I hope you will wait till you get married. But if you do get pregnant before you get married, I am overjoyed to have you in this new life, and that you will always be welcome with us, and we're always going to support you. That's the way that you end abortion in our society, not through laws and regulations. I honestly, I think they're going to go back and forth for the next 200 years about this, trying to one up one another through some legal avenue, some discuss, legal opinion. I'm not a lawyer, so I read this and I say, yeah, I don't understand why this is happening. I'm happy less babies will die. I'm happy to see power decentralized. I'm not a legal scholar, so I can't tell you if I'm happy about this or not, because frankly, I don't understand it.
Yeah.
And I admit that openly. I don't understand the legal ramifications of all of this, but what I do understand is less babies will die. Yeah. So I'm happy.
Yeah. So maybe a final question, because this is kind of on the theme of what I think, partly why I wanted to talk to you.
Sure.
What do you think would have helped you the most when you were considering abortion to change your mind and feel better prepared for motherhood? Would it have been an argument? Would it have been a certain level of support, community? Is there one thing that you think at that time might have pushed you in a different direction?
I was completely alone without support. The father of my child was an abusive person, and I was disconnected from any kind of support structure that I had when I found out that I was pregnant. I believed, because of what, the society's attitude toward motherhood and pregnancy, that if I had this baby, I was a teenager. If I had this baby, it meant my life was over. That I had no way of having success. I would always be in poverty. This was the greatest shame and anathema that a young girl could possibly do. And so the responsible thing to do would be to have an abortion. And there was no one in my life who told me anything other than, well, it's your choice. You got to make a choice. Well, I was a teenager. I needed somebody to give me guidance, a little bit of guidance. You know what? You don't have to do this. Because even in my time, we're talking about over 20 years ago when this happened, even in that time, there were methods of support, but I didn't know what they were. I didn't have access to them. And I had no one in my life who was willing to tell me it's going to be okay. This is actually a blessing. Children are good things. So if anything, and this is maybe something I feel like when I have these discussions that people always feel like I'm veering off the point when I say this, but I think it's the main point. Children are blessings. Children are wonderful things. And if we change the attitude about children in our lives and what it means to have children, and what a great and awesome responsibility and wonderful gift it is, that could change the minds of a lot of women who are considering abortion. Because what are you, why are you getting rid of this child? Because you feel it's a burden, because it's more than you can handle. There's all kinds of, reasons that women don't feel supported enough to go through with having the child. So if we create mechanisms of support for young women who find themselves in the family way, will go a long way toward decreasing abortion, much more so, I think, than any ban will ever accomplish.
Jessica, I want to thank you for taking time to do this with me. People who want to learn more about you, see what you're doing. Your podcast is The Mad Ones. The website for that is wearethemadOnes.com.
That's right.
And you are on Twitter at
Yes.
Soup Can Archist.
Soup Canarchist, yeah.
Soup Can, but then can is combined with anarchist. So Soup
Anarchist, right.
Anyway, so thank you for doing this. I really appreciate you being willing to kind of be open and honest, because I think this is a tough issue that I think pro-lifers, I don't want to say we need to do better, because there's some people who I think are really doing some excellent work.
Killing it. Yeah.
I don't want to sell those people, but I think I want to see that expand.
Just know that the work is just now beginning. This isn't like where we rest on our laurels. This is where we really start doing the work, and the work is about supporting pregnant women.
Yeah, it would be wonderful if pro-lifers and religious communities would be so supportive and so effective in changing minds that when it came time for laws to be written, the appeal of making abortion easily accessible would not be so strong. Right.
Right. Couldn't agree more. Wonderfully said.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.